Mara works in the Italian Research Council. That's a big organization, and the small unit is in Turin. And the institute is called Institute for Atmospheric Research and Climatic. But for most of you, Amara doesn't need introduction because you don't have one before. So today we talk about fire models and the rainfall and wildfires and stochastic intermittent perturbations. Please, Mara, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ivan. Thank you, Kinji, and Anna also for inviting. So it's nice to be back for a little bit as visiting professor. So I am. I've always liked the complex system environment in general at this center because when I was young, I studied physics, but then I quickly moved to ecology. So I use complex system, especially dynamical system methods in ecology mostly. And for subjects, I study mostly plants. I've been looking at fire and drylands and the savannas. So you will hear some of this stuff today. Technically, as I said, I'm mostly a modeler. So for those that are more on the technical side in the audience, the mathematical side, I work a lot with differential equation, ordinary or partial, more ordinary. And today I'm going to talk to you about pulse perturbation, delta-like. So perturbations that, in other words, that just come and go. So they are on-off, they perturb the system and then they are gone. And one of them is fires. And a good example in ecologies are fires because they occur maybe depending on the system. In savannas, they can even occur once a year. In Mediterranean system, maybe every 20, 50, depends a bit on the vegetation years, but they occur once and then it takes time to the system, for the system to recover. So they are actually a sort of on-off perturbation. Another so it's strange that I'm talking about fires and rainfall. If you look at the rainfall's time series, this is summer time series in Turin, if I remember correctly. It doesn't matter. You could, maybe not in the Netherlands, especially before climate change, you could almost approximate rainfall as constant, but in most places, well, I know that a lot of Dutch people, there's one in the room that model rainfall as constant, so they always use that as an excuse, but I'm kidding, I'm not nothing personal with them. I've done that too, but the rainfall is actually quite a bit of intermittent nature also, on-off dynamic. So there's a shower and then it goes. So again, for the technical side of the story, this means that if you're using differential equations, I have been looking in several systems at the fact that these are not just a little bit of noise, like perturbing a parameter with a bit of white noise, like that's done in stochastic differential equation. And these are actually stochastic terms that go into the equation, and they can be a parameter like rainfall that is forcing the system and is stochastic, but they can also be part of the dynamical system, so like what I call their state-dependent function, meaning that, for example, the fires depend on the vegetation itself. They will occur only when there is enough plant material, and they will occur more frequently when the plants are of a certain type rather than the other. So this stochasticity is even more complicated mathematically because it depends on the state of the system. So we will look a bit at these two examples today. One is the fact that, especially in drylands, that's why I was comparing with the Netherlands, nothing personal, but in drylands, especially this sporadic nature of rainfall is important, and it has effects on ecosystem. And the second is the global fire ecosystems. So what are drylands? As the audience is broad, I will briefly mention that drylands are areas defined as exposed to a range of climate from arid to dry subhumid, where most ecosystems are limited by water. The limiting resource for plants, especially, is water. And the water is not generally scarce, but also sporadic and coming in intermittently. So when it comes, you might have a big shower, but it's rare in time. It's not often in time. They're quite broadly spread around the world. One might think of the Sahara only, but no, we're talking about areas that are highly inhabited and with some plants, there's not that many. And the UNCCD, which is the UN, I don't remember the exact acronym, but they are talking about the risk of desertification. It's an agency of the UN. They estimate that it's about 40% of the air plant surface, so not very. I mean, it's impressive area, and because of this, they also have a third of the human population, and they're supposedly, although I've read recently there's some debate, but they're supposedly threatened by climate change. In some areas, it might rain more, but let's leave it. In general, we say that the area might even increase, of drylands might increase. The expected changes are in temperature, of course, generate more evaporation, so even if you have the same rainfall, it's a threat. But also that there are surely expected changes in temporal distribution of rainfall, more extreme events, a bit like in many places on Earth, and a longer drought period. So because of all this, we think that studying rainfall as an intermittent and not a constant in this vegetation model is actually important. So I will first show you how the plants are actually adapted. Dryland plants are actually adapted to this, and they actually can have live better because they are adapted to this rainfall. So they get an increase in plant cover. We showed this back in the days with a very simple model where we model soil, water, and vegetation cover. Soil moisture is very important because it's a bit integrating the rainfall into the soil, integrating in the mathematical sense of the word, in the sense that the water comes into the soil, it gets stored and then released slowly. So actually this pulse of the rainfall gets integrated over time. It stays available for longer because the soil stores it. So it's important to get that right in a model. And so we have here a soil moisture variable that is normalized with some dimensions. We have an input term that depends on the infiltration from rainfall. So you get your rainfall series there, but that we modeled as this is where the stochasticity comes in. This rainfall has two dimensions that are stochastic. So the intensity of the rainfall is stochastic, and the times between events is also stochastic. And so they are delta-like. It's a Poisson, instantaneous Poisson process. And actually what doesn't fit in the soil then runs off. So you have a soil with a certain depth, and what doesn't fit from your event is actually lost. You fill in, they're called bucket models, this simple soil moisture. You model your soil as a bucket with so much space, more or less half of the soil is empty space that can be filled in by water. And then you have losses that are due to evaporation from bare soil and to transpiration from plants. These functions are quite nonlinear with the content of soil moisture. Let me say, so this is zero soil moisture, and this is above this threshold, the soil starts leaking. So this part is actually not evapotranspiration, but it's what is called leakage. It's like a sponge. At some point, it will start leaking, and losses are very big, even though not all the space is full. But below this, we have this threshold behavior of evapotranspiration, and more. Also, there's also a zero at the beginning, meaning there's also some nonlinearity. You cannot really dry a soil completely. So this represents lower losses from bare soil than from vegetated soil. So when I said that it's an integration, if you input your rainfall time series, in this case it was real data, and you look at the soil moisture, where did it go? Yeah, if you model the soil moisture look at the black lines is the model, the red are actual data measured. You see that there is an integration. So from here you have a pulse, and here you have an increase in soil moisture and then a slower decrease. That's what's happening. And this was without vegetation yet. And then we model the vegetation with a simple logistic equation. The variable here is the vegetation cover. I'll be using, well, not all models. In many of the models I show, I'll be using vegetation cover rather than biomass. The key here to mention is that the growth rate, or because it's cover, this is vegetation, this is colonization rate, it's actually a nonlinear function of soil moisture. So plants don't invest, and that's the dark continuous line. Plants don't invest in growth unless there's enough water. And this is a very steep nonlinear function, but it's actually reasonable that there is this on-off behavior in plants. So if there's not enough water, I'm not going to invest in growth. I'm just, keeping it as it is. And this is quite key to the result in a second, because this actually allows the plants to grow a lot when there is a shower, and then to stop growing when there is not enough water. So when we looked, we compared how would the plants fare under a constant average rainfall or under a more realistic intermittent rainfall, model stochastically. We actually saw that for drier area, so drylands between 100 and 500 millimeters a year, actually the plants are well adapted to the fact that the rainfall is not constant, so that it comes in pulses, and actually their cover is larger than if the rainfall is constant. You can take it as they're well adapted, so this makes sense, or you can take it as, oh, it's a new result. But in a way, but it also tells that it's important to model from a technical point of view. It makes a difference if you model or not the elasticity of the rainfall, especially because here, for example, you wouldn't have, for the constant rainfall, the black line, you wouldn't have any vegetation, while you do have vegetation when you include these temporal oscillations. Basically, the wet periods allow the plant to grow, then it waits, and then it grows again at the next rainfall, which is observed, so it makes sense. We looked, after this, much more recently, we looked at how this has an effect on plants' coexistence, and how is this connected to different plant responses. So what I described as plants that grow when it's wet, but they wait, and when it's drier, well, it's actually different depending on the type of plants. And can this help plants to coexist? That's an old question in biology, in ecology. Why do so many plant species coexist? Because on simple models that would have, for example, here 2 species and 1 resource, all of them would lead to the existence of only 1 species. And there's so-called plankton paradox. There's very many species of plankton, and they all use only so many, 5, 6 resources. So how is it possible that you have hundreds of species? And we ecologists have been struggling with this and trying to give different answers have been given. But in this framework, we also looked at it for plants that have different traits. So we have one plant that is less drought resistance, but that has a better optimal growth rate. So when it's wet, it grows faster. And another plant that is more drought resistant, but then when it's wet, I forgot to say, to write it, when it's wet, it has a lower optimal growth rate. And this was a work by Mark Verweimerer, we published last year, was inspired during his PhD by his field site, where actually there were two different types of shrubs, and he planted one of them under the bigger shrubs. Actually, he was looking at something else, which is protection from goats, another type of mechanisms, but in the way we also modeled that. I'm not going to talk about it, but in the way we, like serendipity, we found this result about water and adaptation. So this was his model. The soil-water equation is similar to before, just the terms are written more separately. Evaporation, transpiration of 2 different types of plants. And the plants have different adaptation to drought. So this can be plotted this way. The growth rates for the plant that we call N, that is more drought resistant, it can grow at lower level of soil moisture, but it has a lower optimal growth rate. And the other plant that has a higher optimal growth rate stops growing at higher values of soil moisture. So the two curves actually cross, and this is quite, actually this is a feature that is relevant for the results. So when we look at how they coexist, here we have different levels of rainfall inter-arrival time. So how the average value at which rainfall would occur in this stochastic distribution, meaning the 1 is 1 day, so it's every day is raining on average. 8 is the realistic value of rainfall in the wet season in the fifth side in southern Spain. So every 8 day on average can be 30, it's stochastic. And now if the 1 is the closest to constant, but still a bit realistic, say, there's not too. Now we have the dashed lines representing the species P and the continuous line representing the species N. Species N was the drought resistant one. So you see that when for the blue curve, when the rainfall is every day on average, there is no coexistence of the two plants because the species P is 0 up almost to 450 millimeter. This site was in this area, I think, and we explored a range around it. But as soon as you add a bit of realism in your rainfall, actually the two species coexist. So both the dashed and the continuous line, both in the yellow and in the red case, they are above 0 already at 50 millimeter a year. So this tells us that the intermittency leads to coexistence, and the coexistence range actually increases with coexistence. This is because the two plants have these different water use strategies. So when it's wet, one of the two is better off at taking up water and growing, but when it's dry, the other one is. And therefore, they can both coexist thanks to these temporal dynamics. They don't go to an equilibrium, but they oscillate between different states, basically, at which one is the best competitor or the other. So this might be a very common mechanism, actually, for coexistence of plants in drylands, and some people have been looking at data also with regard to this. So I don't know if we want to do questions now or afterwards, because now I'm finished with the rainfall. Yeah.
So how do you check the in the previous plot? How do you check for the biomass at because there is no equilibrium point? So do you do some averaging or what?
Yes, I didn't run these simulations myself, but my suggestion, so I think is the best guess, is that we run it for long enough that it gets to some sort of stochastic equilibrium, and then you do it. This is the average. Yeah, I forgot to mention. So that's
right.
In the previous plot we had stars because it was more clearly average. Mark just plotted continuous line.
And maybe a bit more speculative question. So what makes qualitative difference in this setting?
What makes?
Qualitative difference from the model where you don't have perturbations? Because you could have made your perturbations not stochastic, but equilibristic. And you can get as stochasticity as a Poisson process. You can maybe even correlate those spikes, so it's not a Poisson process, but in summer you have less rain in the winter, so it's on. So at which point?
I think the first thing is the poles, but actually for the fire, I'm gonna say something that we are looking into this type of differences. Here we didn't, or maybe I did some run with regular fire rainfall backing. But I think the first thing is the poles, because you need, for example, for the coexistence, you need the soil moisture to oscillate enough between the range between here, where the P continuous line is the best competitor, to here, where the other plant is the best competitor. So they also always have a chance to. Now, as the soil moisture dynamic is quite complicated because it's also nonlinear, so how much you can lower maybe you need also sometimes to have longer breaks between your rainfall. And if you have regular with the same, say, average than in a stochastic case with regular pulses, your soil moisture doesn't get low enough. So maybe depending on the rainfall level, you might also need the stochasticity to get these longer periods, the longer dry periods. Because when you have stochasticity, what you have is you might have two rainfall events close to each other, but that saturates, so at some point it doesn't matter anymore.
Right.
Then what matters is the dry ones, so that you make it dry enough that it has a time to get in the area where otherwise if it's always above threshold, then it's always one winning, so you will not be favored.
Yeah.
So it should be looked at that more precisely, what are the differences.
And how do you see this? Do you see as one stable point and the other is metastable, or?
I think you're oscillating between two stable points. Well, in my head.
Okay, so you have two stable points and you're.
Well, it's because I see the one point is the one with rainfall and the one without.
So why does it come back?
Because you keep perturbing. It's
Yeah,
a system that you keep perturbing, so it keeps. Then, well, in my head, you perturb it and then it tends to go back, and then you perturb it again and it tends to go back. And
yeah, but then this one is metastable.
But it depends on how you.
Yeah. Okay.
How you frame it.
Yeah, so there should be a mechanism to come back in a way. Without rain. So if there will be no rain, you should come back. Okay?
Yeah. The without, I mean, if without rain, zero is the stable state. If you look at it, it's simple dynamics, and it's always stable.
Yeah.
Without rain, there's no chance. And then you have the other vegetated states, and you're just moving between them. But with the fire, I mean, yeah, because the fires, I'll get to it in a second.
Cool.
It's also a matter of how you as you said, you could also conceptualize this as one. This for ecologists is one system. They don't see it as an oscillation between a vegetated and a bare soil. It's just a system that coexists thanks to the temporal oscillation. It's a matter of framing. So you could also maybe model it on averages. Are there more questions?
Yeah. Question. So in the model, especially between the the relationship between the soil moisture and the biomass or plant cover dynamics, I think I missed the inhibiting effect of excessive soil moisture to the plant growth.
Because I modeled drylands.
So I mean, is it because the plants in the dryland area is super flooding tolerant, or is it because for the
no, it's I mean, during a big showers, you can actually have, like, if you have a slope, there can be erosion and you get the whole thing. I mean, the showers can be very strong, so it's true that there is downsides, but it doesn't last long. So these sort of necrotic effects that you can imagine in the other ecosystem, because the soil is wet, that's not gonna be a problem. Like, it's too hot, it's evaporating very quickly, the plants just transpire like crazy. It's not, I don't know, it's not a main matter of concern in drylands. Maybe in some specific locations that are more pondy-like, but that I was not looking at. Most of these locations are on slopes. I didn't have that in the model, but that means also that water just runs off very, very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Can I ask something? So, I was wondering, between those rainfall events, wouldn't any plant be completely dying out? Is that a possibility in your?
In fact, basically, we are modeling wet seasons of drylands. Then during dry seasons, I didn't mention, but Mark modeled it even explicitly. These plants go dormant during dry seasons, and meaning that some, for example, shed their leaves, like they're drought deciduous, otherwise they would die. But in the wet season, hopefully, I mean, they are adapted enough to survive the rare but still present showers. I mean, of course, at some point, if you have no shower ever, you get to the Sahara, but that's not, But so these dynamics are at play during the wet season, which is still pretty dry for but it's still a wet season for the drylands. Makes sense.
Just to follow up on that, is there, so I can understand there is a minimal annual rainfall, I guess,
Yeah,
before you end up in the Sahara.
yeah,
But
that depends.
Wouldn't there be also a minimum or maximum distance between these rainfall events? So if the drought periods become longer, at some point, they also will die?
Well, when they have this mechanism, so if they think it's a drought, then they have otherwise they wouldn't be living in such places. The plants that don't have this mechanism, so they have mechanisms to go into dormancy. These plants are super resilient. I mean, it's crazy what they can do. So if it gets long enough, then it becomes, but of course, if they skip a wet season, yeah, there will be some individuals dying for sure, because it never comes. It's not that they can be into dormancy for 100 years and wait for the rain. So yeah, but I guess that's one of their adaptations, that they can just freeze basically. Well, like our plants can survive winter, so they have that. But if then spring never comes, yeah, then yes, you have a problem, of course. So there might be, when you get into more physiology, there might be room for looking at how long it can be, this type of things, for sure, yeah. Some plants will do better than others. Yeah, but it must be said that these plants are very slow, so it's not a good system to study for models, because to look at in the fields, to get data and look at the time evolution, it takes forever. They are also very resilient because of that. They are very, yeah, they can wait. Okay, let's move on to fires. So the idea for fires was that in many systems you have some vegetated forested states, and you're probably all familiar with the famous double well. So this state would be stable actually, but then fires actually not only perturb it, but create a new state, which is deforested, or an open shrubland was for this specific case, which was a paper that we published in the Mediterranean, also with Ruben here. But in general, it can be also for the tropics, it could be a degraded forest, tropical forest, savanna-like, that is maintained by fires. So we are going to look at whether the fire, as a part of the dynamics, can maintain a different, qualitatively strongly different type of ecosystem. And this was work that, besides Ruben that is sitting here, I have been doing as a part of the PhD of Marta Magnani, so I was supervising her, but she's now a postdoc still in Torino with us. So of course, there have been a lot of news about fires, and everybody's worrying about fire. This was crazy fires in Australia in 2019-20, that winter, right before COVID. It was an extreme fire season. But it must also be said, so it is true that in some places things are exacerbating because of climate change, but it's also should be said that fire is part of ecosystem dynamics. Fires have been on Earth for a little bit less long than plants have, but very long still, and the plants have adapted. So the fires have shaped the evolution of plants, and the plants have adapted to them. And fires have even led to the emergence of certain biomes. For example, savannas. So savannas are not only determined by the presence of herbivore and by the climate that is there and the presence of herbivore and carnivores, but savannas are strongly determined by the fact that they burn. And the why is because there is a positive feedback between grasses that determine savannas. So savannas are these open spaces, can be more or less open, sometimes they're quite relatively close. But the presence of these dry grasses is determinant to decide that woodland is actually a savanna. This type of grasses, they are perennial grasses, they're tall, and they dry out in the dry season and they burn very well. When they regrow the next season out of the roots, so they're very well adapted to fires. So fires limit the growth of trees. Trees would actually shade grasses, but this makes it into a positive feedback that you either have a state with grasses or a state with trees, a forest, a tropical forest, where tropical forest trees don't have any strategy to cope with fire. So if they burn, they just die. There's no seed left. They don't have any chance to regrow. This has been looked at in data also field data, and other people before us and us in a bit of a different way. We looked at MODIS data, so satellite data. Specifically, this is a graph over sub-Saharan Africa of tree cover. And we identified with other data which points would have savanna trees and which points would have tropical forest trees. And there's some range of mean annual rainfall and other climatic conditions that are the same, but nevertheless, we observe both tropical forest and savannas, while the environmental factors seem all to be the same. And if you look at fires, then the fires, because fires to me, they're an endogenous factor and not an environmental factor, they're determined by the system. So I don't look at it as an explanatory variable, but more as a descriptive variable of my system. These places have, where was the cursor? Yeah. These places have frequent fires, and these places have very rare fires. In general, about fires, one of the things that has been studied mostly it's climate and weather effects on fire. So people try to predict when a fire will occur or there's a drought, and especially for prediction, climate has been studied a lot. Of course, wind is necessary for the fire to spread. So there's all these models predicting when the fire, when what will burn, trying to predict for clear reason. Another thing that has been studied quite a bit is the role of plants as fuel. It's clear that plants are necessary to burn. If you are in to drive a place with a plant, a bush here and a bush there, if that bush burns, it stays, so that's not a relevant fire. So you also need enough plants. It's not enough that it's dry. So flammability has been studied quite a bit. What has been less studied that we have, not only us, but we have been recently looking at is the role of other characteristics of plants which are connected to fire adaptation and to their response post fire. Because we think that this is not only, in the example of the savannas before, is not only the fact that the grasses like to burn are flammable that is relevant, but it also the fact that they can grow after a fire, they can regrow easily. And conversely, a tropical forestry doesn't have any strategy, so it doesn't know when it burns, it dies, seed don't survive, there's no way to get it back. So it doesn't have a fire response. And in that feedback loop, it's clear that you need both sides of the arrow. But this is what we're going to look at in the coming 10 minutes, and the role of plant post-fire responses together with all the rest. And it has not been looked at so much. So with Marta, we had the idea to try to disentangle the relationship between the plant characteristic and the resulting fires, and to also identify if, for example, alternative ecological states, like the case of the savanna and the forest, are possible or not, depending on the type of the characteristics of the plants you have. So how the plant's characteristic determine the existence of alternatives, ecological states. And we did this with a model that can be applied in any fire-prone ecosystems across the world. So a bit to study it in a generic way, and we also applied it to specific systems, though. So we, I was already saying that we have parameterized also the model for specific cases to be a bit more realistic, but it can be adapted to many more systems. So briefly, how is the model structure? The model we started with a classical model that is used for succession. So this process of replacing of different species, one after each other, that leads in the traditional theory leads to a climax, which is the only possible final state of your ecosystem. And the model includes so some sort of hierarchy. So this is the best competitor, typically for light, for example, the plant that is going to shade all the others, and it goes down with the, we use 3 equations in the hierarchy. So this is going to suffer from the shade of B2 and B1, and B2 is going to suffer from the shade of, or the competition more generically, of B1. The first, we always chose the first 2 as 3 species, and the third, it depends on the ecosystem, if they were low plants or a tree themselves. Again, I'm modeling cover. So actually, the first equation is identical as in the case of the first rainfall model. Yeah, this one thing that can be said about this model is that it is a simplified version of Baudena, where only some of the coefficients are left, like in a triangle, upper triangle. Then we added fires. So fires are, now we get to the stochastic pulses. Fires are the stochastic events. And when stochastic events occur, the plants would be instantaneously reduced in cover. In this way, so the B after fire is equal to R B before fire. And this R is a factor that goes between 0 and 1. So if you have a 0, it means you have basically no, every individual is dead in your, that compose your vegetation type. And you also don't have, 0 is a stable state you cannot get out of. So you really don't have any possible strategy to get out of the black hole. And if you have 1, basically you don't feel the fire at all. So that's also a bit too extreme, but anything in between, it's possible. And the fire return time of this stochastic exponential distribution of fires is determined by the amount of cover that you have, because you need plants to burn, and by their flammability. So there's more flammable plants, and they can have different. So these 2 characteristics are what we are going to look at: flammability and fire response. You can have very flammable species that also have a very good fire response, like for example savanna grasses. Other plants can have a bad fire response, but also are not very flammable. This could be, for example, a tropical forestry that makes the environment very humid and wet, so it's not likely to burn. But then if it burns, it doesn't have any strategy to regrow. So this is the mean of the stochastic distribution of the fire. And this is just a representation of how this means that in your time series, depending on which plants you will have a fire sooner or later, right? Because the stochastic term is state dependent. Then we end up with time series. These are the stochastic perturbation with of the vegetation cover, and then, so for example, if you're here, there's a fire, your vegetation gets perturbed, reduced 80%, and then it regrows again. And these are the 3 different types that typically tend to represent key either species in system with few species, or key functional types for a certain ecosystem that we're going to look at later. So we first look at what combination of characteristics can actually occur in plants. Which set of characteristics can lead a plant, PFT's plant functional type, to exist or at all in given different fire regimes or in different conditions, or leading to different fire regimes, because the fire is endogenous also. So the first thing we look at let's look at the bottom graphs. The bottom graphs describe in green vegetation cover, so darker stands for more higher cover, and we get flammability, different values of flammability as a parameter on the y-axis, and fire resistance on the x-axis. And the left is a fast colonizer, like grasses, for example. The right graphs is for slower colonizers, like trees. So if we look first at these bottom graphs, you see that there is a sort of a relationship between flammability and fire resistance. What does it mean? It means that if I'm very fire resistant, I can have any flammability. I can be even very flammable. So one, here it's a one, sorry for the small numbers, it means it burns every year, and this goes to up to infinity, it never burns. But if I'm very, very fire resistant, I can resist and survive any flammability, a bit less so if I'm a slow grower tree. So the speed of growth also matter. But if I'm generally, there's this relationship tells us that on the other hand, if I don't have a fire resistance, I can only be a plant that is not flammable, at least as long as I live alone. Because if I'm flammable and I don't have a fire resistance, probably evolution has kicked me out. I mean, I'm dead. I don't have a response to fire and I burn off, and well, it doesn't seem a successful trait, the combination of traits. This leads to an emergence in these are the fire return time. I will not get into the details, but just remind you that the fires here are an emergent phenomenon from the dynamic of the vegetation. And so there is a relationship between the type of plants you have and also the type of fire recurrence that you get. The second question that we try to answer, I already anticipated, is that how do these plant characteristics lead to existence of different alternative ecosystem states, or not? And which are the most important in the first place? So first we did a sensitivity analysis and we found out that the characteristics that matter most is the post-fire response of the dominant trees. Followed by the growth rate, the colonization rates of the subdominant trees, and also then the growth rate of the dominant PFT1. One word, why the post-fire response of the dominant trees? There's a system, well, maybe I can illustrate that with the examples. Let's go to the example. So once we established with the sensitivity analysis that these were the two, especially the first two, most important characteristics, then we can use them on graphs of this type where we have the fire response of the dominant plants and the growth rate of the second species. And then the colors represent what type of states I'm observing. So now in the following, I'm going to use 3 different ecosystem examples which we parameterized from data. So they will have a fixed value for all parameters. And then because this parameter space, the hypervolume, is very hard to explore. We explored a plane of the parameter, in the parameter space, a plane that is around the real values of the system. And the systems we looked at were the Mediterranean biome, tropics, forests and savannas, and the boreal biomes where fires are also quite important. So for the Mediterranean, I had already worked before with a more complicated model, and we already expected this. When in the Mediterranean we have the dominant tree, it's a type of oak that is evergreen. It's dominant because it's shade tolerant, but it's also very fire resistant. So if it burns, give it some time because it's a slow grower, but it will regrow. It will grow out of its roots first of all, and then it will take over. So when you have such a dominant plant, to the surprise of my co-author of the Mediterranean paper, when you have such a strong dominant plant, actually you cannot have alternative ecosystem states, because given enough time, this dominant strong resprouter will actually, strong post-fire response, will actually dominate. So in the Mediterranean, under current and past climate condition, actually, Mesic Mediterranean, not the driest parts, actually the forests are going to get back. Now they are recovering after, say, there's a lot of land abandonment there. The forests are regrowing, and without climate change, we would expect them to get back. What happens on this parameter plane can also be thought a bit of as climate change that actually will reduce the fire response of the dominant plant, because they need energy to respond already to the drought. So we move to the left, And we end up in this pink area, and the legend is not very clear, but I can believe me, that we have there alternative stochastic states between this closed forest and an open. So the other types of plants are a pine with shrubs, which is also typical Mediterranean vegetation, but it's a lot more flammable, burns a lot more often. They have quite some strategy also to cope with fire, especially the shrubs. So we are gonna have this type of alternative ecosystem states in the Mediterranean only if the dominant plants get so reduced in its post-fire responsibility a lot by climate change. Otherwise, it's not gonna happen. This is how important the fire resistance of the dominant plant is, because it can lead to changes completely of type of vegetation. Then we parameterized the system for tropical savanna and forest, and now we ended up in this part of this graph. Notice that these plants have different lifespan, so they have very different parameter, and it's striking how this parameter plane is similar to the previous one, but there's no particular reason. It's really far away. But our system is now here in the pink, so in the alternative ecosystems state area between the dominant tree, which is now a tropical forest tree, doesn't have any fire response, and that's why we are here to the left, because this is the fire response of the dominant tree. Doesn't have fire response, it typically doesn't burn, so low flammability, but if it burns, it doesn't regrow. The other states, which is composed by savanna trees that can respond to fire, but are less good competitor, they cannot grow in the shade of the tropical forest trees, and the determinant of savannas, which are the grasses that are very flammable, very good fire response. So, because now your dominant tree doesn't have a post-fire response, you can actually have the alternative ecosystem states. And again, if for some reason, maybe in some different tropics, may be possible, some tropical forest trees in Australia actually have post-fire responses. But if you were to be here, then again, just give it some time, the tropical forest would recover. You need to have the dominant tree to have low fire response to be in a system. That's why it's very common in the tropics to study stability between savannas and forests. And it wasn't in the Mediterranean, and we explored it, and it's, yeah, the reason is in this characteristic of the dominant species, we think. The last, not least case is the boreal ecosystem. There's so few species that our plants are actually specific, targeted to specific species, two different type of conifer for the first two, and a third deciduous trees that, like birch and poplar, they grow quickly in the open spaces after fire, but they don't do very well when the canopy closes in the shade, so then they disappear. What we see is cycles here. I believe I have oh, did I skip the strange? Okay, I thought I had a temporal series. So we have now complicated dynamics with cycles of one canopy type, one conifer type, or the other conifer type, black spruce with the deciduous tree, or the deciduous trees with the first. And actually, in the paleo record, canopy type, cycles have been observed in the boreal. So their fire return times are very long. So you need paleo record to look at this, because we are talking maybe of fire frequencies of 200 years or 300 years, so quite rare, but they occur. It's naturally before climate change, which is exacerbating fires in the polar region, in boreal regions, in fact. So this also seems to make sense, and the coexistence of maybe different patches at different states of these cycles might also be explaining why this also seems to be observed. Coexistence of different patches of these conifers. So it seems to get back quite well to what is in the observations as well. I am almost over time, although I already took some questions. So I just wanted to say that we have looked now at quite a complicated system where we have stochastic perturbation and they are state dependent. So there's a feedback. And thanks to the help, the work of Ruben, we're trying to look at what happens is instead the system is a bit simpler. And for this case, Ruben has developed analytical solutions. So for regular perturbations and no dependence on the state, so there is no feedback. Simply fires come. It burns because you can have different frequency because of different climatic conditions. What actually is a bit left to be done is the other two corners, one of which is pretty difficult, the stochastic even without feedback, and the regular or non-stochastic with feedbacks. Some things can be done surely at the level of one species, but also some more. Briefly for the case of regular without, we're up here, so regular without feedback, what it's actually, if you start with this local terras with impulses, you can use the parameters that represent the fire response and the period of the fires and to rescale your local terra system and then solve this system instead. So you can solve a non-impulsive system. I'm saying this because I know there's quite some mathematician in the audience that might be interested. So actually, if you know about the pulse system, come to talk to us after the talk. We'll be very happy. But this is quite an interesting result because you can study a system with impulses actually as with a continuous system. So just looking at the stability of the new local terra system with the parameters that are rescaled. I don't know if I explained myself with that. And one ecological development is that we want to expand this to N species to look at how disturbances such as fires or others can influence diversity. There's a hypothesis that says that diversity is maximum at intermediate level of disturbances. And actually, we can see that if we extend this model to N species, we can actually look at whether this hypothesis is verified or not, at least in the model. So these are my conclusion, but I want to leave space to the questions. Just to say, plant post-fire responses matter. They are not included in global vegetation models, for example, that are in the climate models. Or not even, and although they can change your ecosystem biome from late night to day, so you probably should look into that a little bit more. At least that's what we think. Thank you.
A little bit time for questions.
I have a question. So I might have missed that, but how did you determine the key plant functional traits, say the post-fire response?
Yeah, we did some sensitivity between the plant traits that we have. It's not really traits, characteristics. We did some, no, I didn't show it. We did some sensitivity analysis and we looked at which parameters would lead to most shift in the community type. And well, I didn't put the figures. So we did this with simulations. We also did it with a simplified version of the model with some analytical results. And it shows that the one parameter that has most effects, that if you change, leads to most changes of community type, was the fire response of the dominant species. It's a good question. It's actually, yeah, I just cut it because keeping the story short.
Can I ask you, in the previous slide where you said that there is this hypothesis about intermediary perturbation, and if it's very large, then the rest should decrease.
Yes.
Can you give the explanation why should it decrease? Is it because
Well, the idea is that, well, so I'm not sure if it's true or not, it's a hypothesis, but you can reason this way. If there is too little perturbation, you are in this climate's final system with a few species that survive and all the others have been kicked out. If you perturb it, it's again something a bit like what's happening with the dryland plants, that you shift your system to a different state, so more species can survive in that state. And then if you think of it as perturbation, as I do, then you let the system go, so the system tends to recover to the original state with few species, but then maybe there's another perturbation. So if you have this intermediate regime, you can have a lot of situations where different types of plants can also coexist in this. In this temporary dynamics. But then if the perturbations are just too big, it's some sort of like everything is dead or something. That's the idea, right? Yeah.
So you burn the
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you don't have rain at all, then if you have one pulse of rain with 100 millimeters of rain one day and then no rain for a year, it's going to be very few plants that can have a strategy to cope with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
But it's not proven, and there's some
sure,
data,
okay.
observation, ideas, but it's not. As many things in ecology, but this is one of the many hypotheses.
Any questions online?
Yeah, are there questions online?
keeping track of the charts.
Not so far. If you have questions online, you can voice them.
Maybe I can take a opportunity to ask you about one more. So
Yeah, well, the
from your expert opinion, is it important for people to have to study a system with many species when you talk about diversity? Because you already showed that there is diversity with two species; they can both coexist. So how important is to make a transition for any species one?
It depends on what you want to do. With this, you can tell I became an ecologist because it's a joke.
But
Ecologists always say it
is-
depends, but it's not. It's deeper than that. In the sense that if you look at plant functions as with a certain aim, for example, fire response, but it can be in a global vegetation model to model carbon fluxes or water fluxes, because you need to know water fluxes for the atmosphere to then model the climate. Maybe you don't need to model each individual species separately. And I come a bit from that side, no? That I like plant functional types and modeling mechanistically. But we shouldn't forget, I don't think there's any biologist in the room, otherwise they surely don't forget, that after all, species is the unit of reproduction. So that's a very basic and well-defined unit. There is even some doubt sometimes there, but it's clear, like if the species is gone, there is not going to be any of that DNA reproducing anymore. So it is still, at the very least, a very interesting fundamental question of how can it be that there's so many different species? Why didn't they all collapse to three? Why do we need so many different species in 1 meter by 1 meter of grasses? So there is some really fundamental question. And this has also shown that actually biodiversity functions differently also. So there is more productivity when it's more biodiverse. So this, because probably the ecosystem, there is some optimization mechanism maybe at community level or ecosystem level, not at individual species, because they always live together. So for example, in this other work that you know, I look at plant soil negative feedback, which means that each species grows some limiting factor, for example, pathogen in the soil that are mostly damaging to itself. And therefore, by this way, so if it grows too abundant, there's also too many pathogen, and that's a self-limiting factor. Well, this is favoring other species. And how everybody, and there is even another factor that DNA is self-toxic. So your own litter is toxic to yourself. And as animal, we can imagine that easily. But plants live in their own litter. So people ask immediately, when this was found out a few years back by some colleagues in Napoli, they were a lot of opposition. How can it be that DNA is, how has evolution allowed that the DNA, your own DNA is toxic for plants? But they never live in isolation. So actually they have evolved in community. So maybe that's actually the answer. That's why some things may work only at species level, even though maybe functionally for whatever function you measure, there's many things you can measure for function. You are the same. Your DNA is different, so you behave differently in other ways. So yeah.
To go back to the question I asked. So is there consensus in the community that you need multi-species models when multi is more than two, or you think that's not necessary?
Yeah, to answer certain questions, for example, when it's related to biodiversity at certain time, surely, when it's maybe related to measuring fluxes of carbon, no. So but surely it's a very, very important question. The biodiversity question is considered very important. Because it's also related then to emergencies, like we are losing species by the day. If we will get to 4 degrees plus, we are expected to have mass extinction. But does that matter? Or is it enough which one should be conserved? Should be conserved for function? Or does it, of course, apart from the feeling, oh my God, like it's, you know, you can have a feeling about losing a species because it's gone, the DNA is gone. But you can also be more practical and think, okay, what are we losing?
Social cost of the species.
Yeah, exactly. What's